Is it still fun to hate on 4Kids, or is that just a meme at this point? I remember when I was a young boy waking up every Saturday morning filled with wide eyes and wonder. I would grab my Eggo waffles from the toaster, sit in front of the living room TV, and enjoy media that irrevocably shaped my impression of the world. I was either watching anime adaptations of some of my favorite video games like Pokemon and Sonic, or I was watching Yu-Gi-Oh!, a show that would start one of the worst addictions that I have ever had. These anime and so many more were accompanied by a very colorful logo that even my 5-year-old brain could understand. 4Kids Entertainment. And after years of consuming show after show on multiple networks where that logo would pop up, I feel like I could shout out to the rooftops about how much I love 4Kids, Charlie. I love 4Kids!
I would really not be screaming that at the top of your lungs.
Man, what the hell happened since then? As a kid, that brand became synonymous with all those joyful experiences that I garnered throughout my childhood, but as an adult, I feel like there were times where I'll get burned at the stake for tweeting that I preferred the English dub of Yu-Gi-Oh! Some of that hatred is probably a meme, but I know there are some people out there who see 4Kids as the epitome of everything they dislike about how the United States handled anime. Unlike nowadays, where anime is more or less distributed in the same form across the globe, back during the 90s and early 2000s in the United States, these shows were distributed as almost completely different properties, rife with censorship, story changes, replaced music, removed text, added sound effects, and wacky voice acting. This was done for two primary reasons. The first was that Japanese broadcasting standards were, and still are, fairly different from what we have here in the United States. So companies needed to make sure that there is nothing in these shows that a kid could potentially copy in order to air it all. Fighting was toned down, blood was removed, guns are removed, and we'll never use the D word. Ever. 4Kids was far from alone in this, as companies like Funimation and Saban Entertainment followed similar practices with shows like Dragon Ball and Power Rangers. But I think 4Kids is seen as the poster child for this era because they had, hands down, some of the most egregious examples that I have ever seen. You want your wacky new anime acquisition to appeal to kids? Well, son, let's turn that alcohol into bug juice, bust out the jelly donuts, and give that man a lollipop. Things were weird back then. The second and more cynical reason why this was done was because, from the start, acquiring the rights to these shows was never really about bringing them over in any type of faithful or meaningful way. It was about generating profit and merchandise sales in the easiest way. Why go through the effort of having a new show created completely from the ground up when you can just take a property that is successful overseas, remove anything about it that indicates it takes place overseas, and make it so it's more synonymous with other wacky Saturday morning cartoons at the time? In a lot of ways, it is kind of a smart business practice that did have almost an entire generation of success behind it. The crazy commercials, the fun, memeable moments, and the music. Oh God, the music. I don't know what kind of black magic that 4Kids was operating with back then, but they had their fingers firmly on the pulse of what made music catchy and addictive back then. I don't remember anything about my life prior to the age of 12, but I could quote almost every song from the Pokemon 2BA Master soundtrack that released around that time. In fact, the only thing stopping me from singing the magical Do-Re-Mi Witchling sing-along segments is that YouTube would bury this video so fast if I did, and I'm still not monetized. The point is that 4Kids helped spearhead these franchises into legit cultural phenomena. While you could argue that anime would have been able to catch on just fine during the late 90s and early 2000s without all this extra fluff, since other countries were showcasing things in a more loyal way just fine, I think I can confidently say that if it wasn't for 4Kids, franchises like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Would not have had the global impact that they have today. In fact, they are some of the only long-running franchises that actually show some respect to the early ways that they were presented and marketed back during those early seasons. Pokemon actually became less Japanese specific and culturally ambiguous, meaning that there was less material that 4Kids and later on the Pokemon Company at large needed to cut to broadcast globally. Remember when Pokemon used to have guns? Palworld reference! Even the latest Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie still had a fair amount of cheesy add-ons and one-liners that wouldn't feel out of place back during the 4Kids era, despite being a far more loyal adaptation. Some franchises found that balance between respecting their localization origins while still providing content that fans can enjoy. But decades later, and those examples are kind of few and far between. A lot of shows didn't get the same treatment or didn't get a second chance, so now all of us English-speaking fans have are those hacked up versions, which is why that trade-off doesn't feel worth it. If your favorite show is treated in such a way nowadays, you'd be absolutely furious. Or imagine growing up, watching something and loving it, only to later find out that the version that you loved so dearly was arguably a lie. It also doesn't help that there weren't a lot of legal ways to watch the original versions of these shows in the United States back then, or even now in some cases. So I get it. 100%. But I don't know, I can never really bring myself to generate the same amount of angry vitriol that others had against the brand. Maybe if these practices were still the norm, I'd be right there with you all, but they're not. No matter what Twitter might lead you to think. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I like that era now the same way that I did as a kid. I just think that hate might be going a bit too far. Despite the memes and the cringe, I still feel some type of reverence for that time and respect the components that made up the final products, even if the final products were something that I fundamentally disagree with nowadays. Careers were made off the backs of these shows, with a lot of actors, writers, musicians, and ADR directors now being seen as respected veterans of the entertainment industry. While some of them also weren't super fond of those beginnings, I felt that strong emotional impression thanks to them. Sure, retro games inspired my model and my streams, but my sense of humor and taste in anime started with 4Kids. Sure, you could argue I just gave into the marketing like a dumb kid, but I also don't want to discredit the impact these things had on me back then or the impact they still have on me now. I look at 4Kids the same way that I look back on my awkward teenage years. I was dumb, misguided, and pretending to be something that I wasn't because I felt like I had something to prove. I'm glad that anime localization and I are not repeating most of the same mistakes that we did back then, because I don't see any reason to go backwards. I think it's okay to feel nostalgic for an era while also recognizing the fact that there's a reason why those business practices were left behind in the past. Anime has proven time and time again over the past 2 decades that global appeal can be reached without the need for sanitization or repurposing the content itself. We don't want the jelly donuts, the blank signs, or the overtly sanitized scripts. If we're going to cringe at an anime for being silly and stupid, let it be because the overall product is already silly and stupid. And trust me, there's a lot of examples of that. Whether it's kids, teens, or young adults, the media that we consume doesn't need to hone into one specific market. We have options now, and I could not be happier about that. If anything, I'm jealous of people these days because they could open their phone and watch an episode of Chainsaw Man uncensored at the press of a button. But they'll never have our 90s pop rock. Together forever, no matter how long.